Hey, what is going on, guys? This is SMEB Reviews, and today we are taking a look at the sophomore album from Zayn Malik titled Icarus Falls. Let's get to it. If you're here, you quite possibly know that Zayn Malik was a member of One Direction, a boy band that obviously gained a lot of popularity, but it wasn't necessarily a critical darling. But yet, a band that I never really minded. Yes, they weren't the most amazing band of all time, but honestly, they had some pretty good tracks, and honestly, most of the boys in that band were fairly talented behind the mic. Zayn was one of them, and with his debut album Mind of Mine, I actually did like it. It was a little long-winded, I cannot deny that. Definitely had a little too much runtime in it, but there was a solid album in there, and I really didn't mind it. But like I said, there was just a little too much fluff. So when I saw 27 songs on this album, I knew it'd be a rough ride. But what did we get with Icarus Falls? This album is definitely going for that R&B croon type of album. A lot of tracks are very slow-paced songs that really don't do too much, but can work in some instances. There are a couple solid tracks on here, and some tracks that do stand out, but I said that there were 27 songs, making this one of the longest albums I've listened to this year. And it really starts to wear on you. And a lot of it does come down to the runtime. I think that this album, if it was a fairly standard 10 to 12 track album, it still wouldn't be amazing because there's a lot of rather uninteresting R&B ballads that just don't do too much and really don't connect with me in any way. But that being said, there are still some decent tracks in here and could at least make this a more positive review because Zayn is a talented artist. He actually has a good voice that I do enjoy. It just doesn't quite work with this many tracks, and there's no overarching concept that really draws me in and gives me a reason to care about this album. Ultimately, it's fairly boring throughout most of the album, and most of the tracks kind of just blend together. There are a couple standouts like Sour Diesel, a very funky track that actually has a really interesting bass line and one that I actually enjoy. But then there's tons of tracks that just fall into mediocre R&B ballads, like I said, and it really starts to wear. I had a real hard time even getting through this album once. It's absolutely exhausting just because it's so monotonous throughout so much of it, which is such a shame because he really is talented. He has a powerful voice, but it just doesn't quite emphasize it in this album, and then he really just overdoes himself with 27 tracks. Most artists can't work with that big of an album. There are obviously some albums that a long runtime works for. Take Pink Floyd's The Wall. But that was an overarching concept that was engaging and interesting, whereas this just doesn't quite work. And that's not to say that every one of these ballads is bad. Good Years is actually fairly interesting and shows him trying to prove that he wasted his younger years, and he's trying to get a hold of his life now. And obviously not too deep of a sentiment, but one that's nice, and he really sells it well, and really his crooning voice really does work in this song. But then we get so many tracks that are really just so unbelievably boring. I wanted to like this album, but I feel like that 27 track run length really does kill it. And I do have to note that, like I said, if this album was cut down, really it would be better. I actually would like this album alright, and it would be a more positive review, but this run length just kills it. Just doesn't work for this type of music that he's making, and without the real substance that we need for this kind of release. And that's the ultimate problem with this album. It's not, yes, some of these tracks are fairly boring, but I could overlook a couple boring tracks when we do have a couple solid ones, but there's just so much filler that just does not need to be here. Like I said, almost no artist can really pull out this long of an album, and Zayn, unfortunately, is not one that can. There You Are is probably my favorite track on the album. It does kind of reminisce back to a more One Direction sound with a big bombastic chorus and very pop-like hooks, but honestly, I think that works for him. And I'm not saying that the R&B path is not the right thing. Like I said, Mind of Mine was alright. I didn't really dislike it. It just had too much filler, as this album does, but ultimately I didn't mind of Mine at all. And I feel like this album just, every problem that was wrong with Mind of Mine, with being too long and too much filler, is just, it's just way more in this album. There's way more of that in this album, and it really does kill it. And while I have 27 minutes of material, I really don't have anything else to say, because as I said, a lot of these tracks are kind of similar and just monotonous and don't really do too much throughout the album. So I don't really have too much more to add. I don't really have a track that I go, oh, this is the problem. It's just a lot of boring tracks. And then I mentioned 3 songs that I really do like, and I do truly like those 3. It's just unfortunate that the other 24 kind of fall into that mediocrity that really can get to be a slog to get through this whole thing. So I want to give this a little more slack than I feel like I should. Yes, it's very long, but that's the problem. It's not that these individual tracks are truly bad. It's just that there's way too many of them. So I'm going to give this album a little bit of slack, because I really do want to give him the benefit of the doubt, and these tracks are okay, with a few really solid ones in here. So I'm going to give this one a 4.5 out of 10. What did you think of Icarus Falls? Please let me know down below. Also, is there anything I can do to improve the quality of my videos, or any upcoming albums you'd like me to check out? As I said, I'm ramping down production for December, so I can be working on year-end lists, which will be coming out at the very beginning of January. I'm very excited. I hope you guys are looking forward to it, and I'll see you guys later.